Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today on Political Science, we're going to be looking at the scope of comparative politics. In our last video, we've been able to establish the meaning of comparative politics. Moving further today, we're going to discuss shortly on the scope of comparative politics for us to be able to understand how vast of a field comparative politics is. So stick to the very end of this video to learn about this. Let's get started. When we talk about the scope of comparative politics, we're actually referring to those different areas that comparative politics focus on and how they help us to understand the different operations of political systems around the world. Because most times, when we talk about comparative politics, some persons do think that it's just about comparing two different governments of a country. But it goes beyond that because it also focuses on the comparison of political institutions, structures, culture, behavior, electoral system, party system, policy, decisions, and several other things that are political related. So we're going to be taking this one after the other for us to be able to understand those various areas that comparative politics tends to cover. Let's get started. The first is political systems. This area of comparative politics allows us to compare the different political systems that cut across the world. In the world today, you have different political systems. Some countries practice democracy, you have the monarchy, you have dictatorship regimes, and then you have authoritarian regimes and several other practices across the world today. So this aspect of comparative politics allows us to examine all the various ways that this government tends to carry out their operation and how they tend to function. For example, we can compare the democracy of United States of America and that of Nigeria, or even comparing different political systems across the world. This helps us to explain how a particular political system tends to succeed in a particular country and yet fail in another. The next, we have political institutions. We have political institutions like the courts, the parliament, the Congress, and several other political institutions that exist across the different nations of the world today. So this particular area of comparative politics allows us to examine how these different political institutions across the world tends to differ, how they tend to function, how they tend to make law, and how these laws are being implemented by these institutions across the different nations of the world. For example, we can look at how laws are being made by the Congress in the United States of America, how it differs from how laws are being made by the Parliament in the United Kingdom. The next is political structure. The political structure is referring to the overall organization of the states. For example, in Nigeria and United States of America, they practice the federal structure, while countries like United Kingdom and France practice the unitary structure. So this very area of comparative politics allows us to understand and examine how this structure tends to affect the governance and power distribution that exists between and among these different nations of the world. We move over to the next. The next, we have political process. Political process is simply referring to those activities and events through which decision making is being reached in a political system. For example, you have election, which is a form of activity or an event where the citizens get to make their choice of leadership. So this aspect of comparative politics allows us to examine the differences and similarities that cut across the different political processes across the different nations of the world. For example, we can compare the electoral system of United States of America and that of Nigeria. The next is interest group and pressure group. Simply put, interest group are just a group of people that seeks to influence the decision making of the government of their country. This aspect of comparative politics allows us to examine how these different interest groups tend to operate across the different nations of the world. For example, we can look at the strategies being adopted by these various interest groups across the nations of the world. We can look at the roles being placed by these interest groups across the different nations of the world, or even how they tend to determine political outcome across the different nations of the world. And lastly, on the scope of comparative politics, we have policy and governance. This area of comparative politics allows us to examine the different policies being made across the different nations of the world. In this particular area, we'll be able to understand why is it that a particular policy succeeds in this country, and yet same policy when applied in another country failed. So this area of comparative politics allows us to understand the different policies being made across different nations of the world, be it on healthcare, education, economy, and every other sphere as it concerns the society. This brings us to the end of this video on the scope of comparative politics. A little recap, we're able to establish that the scope of comparative politics include political systems, political culture, political institutions, political structures, political processes, interest groups and pressure group, policy and governance. There are other scopes of comparative politics. These are just the major scope of comparative politics. And as you can see, comparative politics isn't just about the government, but it concerns the citizens, the leaders, the political process, political activities, political action, and anything at all that enables us to understand the global complexities related to politics across the world today. In my next video, I'll be explaining the reasons for comparative politics. Don't forget to like, don't forget to share, don't forget to subscribe. See you in our next video.